I'm going to take you back in time to July 17th, 1996 on the east coast of America. It's 8:30 in the evening and something terrible is about to happen. Ponder this statement from Thomas Jefferson. He was correct. Ignorance and freedom are almost always self-exclusionary. In the way of introduction, my name is Al Francis. I'm a retired TWA 747 captain and recently served as a commissioner on the South Carolina State Aeronautics Commission. I speak on many aviation topics, but only when I give this presentation do I wear my TWA uniform. I do this to honor the TWA employees and family members who died on the evening of July the 17th, 1996. The employees of TWA were more than just fellow workers. I considered them members of my extended family and always tried to treat them as such on my airplane, whether they were members of my crew or passengers on the flight. Normally, I give my lectures extemporaneously, using just a few notes to assist me. But the facts and figures contained in this presentation are so important and detailed that they require me to speak from a prepared text. There are nearly 8,000 words of narration, so please bear with me. What you're about to hear involves a mystery, indeed, a murder mystery. However, although author Nelson DeMille wrote a fictional account of the tragedy entitled Nightfall, the issues concerning the crash of TWA 800 are not fiction, but facts, and very disturbing facts indeed. On the evening of July 17th, 1996, I was sitting with my wife watching the news at our home in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A special report came on the screen, and I was shocked to see and hear that a TWA 747 had crashed shortly after takeoff from Kennedy Airport in New York. Apparently, there were no survivors. At that time, I was the council chairman and captain representative for ALPA Council number 24, and as such was the lead union representative for all the pilots flying TWA's international routes. The pilots on Flight 800 were friends, not merely acquaintances. At the time of the crash, I represented these men, and in respect for their memory, I hope to do so one last time by getting the NTSB investigation reopened. I was well aware that it easily could have been me in the cockpit of that doomed aircraft. I had flown that flight and that airplane many times. Early the following morning, I took the first flight to New York. For the rest of that long day and for many others to follow, I was involved with the agonizing process of trying to discover what had happened to the same airplane which I had flown only a few weeks previously from Athens to New York with my wife and daughter aboard. Sadly, TWA no longer exists. Its demise was caused by many factors, but the final stake in its heart may have been the crash of TWA 800. That is the subject of this presentation. Today, I will attempt to provide you only with the facts as I know them, allowing you to come to your own conclusions. But please try to keep an open mind, because some of these facts might be rather unpleasant for you to accept, but nonetheless they are facts. New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once correctly observed, "We are all entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. There is a difference." Until the events I am about to describe occurred, I trusted my government. Although I knew that individual politicians or members of various government agencies could be venal, untruthful, or corrupt, I still generally had faith that as a whole, our government worked in the best interest of its citizens. That assumption has been severely shaken in my case, and during this presentation I will try to explain why. Recently, we have all been introduced to the term the deep state. I believe this is not a recent phenomena, but indeed has existed for a long time, at least since the early 1960s. Elements of it surely affected the investigation into the cause of the crash of TWA 800, and in a very negative way. I will be referring to various organizations by their standard abbreviations. Some, like the DOJ, FBI, and CIA, are familiar to you. Others, like FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, or the IAM, International Association of Machinists, perhaps are not. Ponder that this horrible crash occurred 2 days before the start of the Summer Olympics in Atlanta and 109 days prior to Election Day 1996. Both dates surely affected what happened next. So, as I probably said 10,000 times or more in my airline career, seatbelt fastened, tray table stowed, seats in the full upright and locked position, and prepare for takeoff. On February 26, 1993, a truck bomb was detonated in the garage of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The bomb was constructed by Ramzi Youssef, a nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Youssef's goal was to have the North Tower collapse, falling into and destroying the South Tower as well. Had the plot succeeded, the death toll would surely have exceeded 100,000. The planners were assisted by Omar Abdelrahman, the so-called blind sheik from Egypt, who was then living in northern New Jersey. The operation was probably financed by Al-Qaeda through Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Osama bin Laden. After the plot failed, Youssef escaped back to Pakistan and began planning another attack. Later referred to as Project Boshinka, which is Croatian slang for a loud bang or explosion, the plan involved the blowing up of 11 U.S. airliners on the same day, all traveling from Pacific Rim cities to the U.S. It also envisioned killing Pope John Paul II and flying an explosive-laden plane into CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. The bomb theory was tested using an explosive device planted on a Philippine Airlines 747 in late December 1994. The bomb was not large enough and failed to bring down the aircraft. Undeterred, Youssef proceeded to design and build bigger bombs, which would be far more deadly. A fire in the Manila apartment where this process was going on alerted the authorities, and he was once again forced to flee back to Pakistan. Captured there, he was returned to the U.S. for trial and was involved in that process when TWA 800 went down. His uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, then began plotting further attacks, one of which culminated in the events of 9/11. There is compelling evidence that he, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah were involved in a plot to shoot down a departing international flight in the U.S. just prior to the upcoming Summer Olympics in Atlanta. Intelligence sources from Germany, France, Israel, and Saudi Arabia informed the U.S. government of such rumors after the June 25th attack on the Khobar Towers facility in Saudi Arabia, which killed 19 American servicemen and seriously injured 498 others. Before that, there had been an attack at a nightclub in Frankfurt, Germany, which had killed and injured scores of customers. It was a popular spot for American servicemen in the area. Then, only 2 days prior to the crash of TWA 800, several Arabic newspapers in London and Beirut received a call from a previously unknown terrorist group, which stated that in addition to the Frankfurt and Khobar Towers attack, there would soon come another, which would, and I quote, astound and amaze with its audacity. The listed date and time for this event was to be very early in the morning of July 18th, which corresponded to the evening of July 17th on the east coast of America. There is evidence that these warnings were not totally ignored, and that the U.S. Navy was testing experimental procedures which would allow them to intercept a missile fired at a civilian aircraft. Did that procedure go tragically wrong on the night of July 17, 1996? That is yet to be determined. On the warm summer evening of July 17, 1996, 230 people died in the crash of TWA 800. Among them were husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, grandparents, and even children. There were 16 students and 5 chaperones from the Montoursville, Pennsylvania High School French Club who were eagerly awaiting their trip to France. Their deaths devastated the school and the small town where they had lived. They died a horrible and violent death, and their souls, along with all the others, cry out for a justice that has thus far been denied them. I hope that what I'm about to tell you will help to right that terrible wrong. This slide depicts a massive explosion which separated the front third of the aircraft from the rest of the fuselage. This, according to a video the CIA produced at the request of the FBI. Supposedly, the explosion was followed by a near vertical ascent of the rear of the aircraft for another 5,000 feet to nearly 18,000 feet mean sea level. However, that scenario has been disputed by most aviation experts as being aerodynamically impossible. Brief minutes after the in-flight explosion, all that was left of the aircraft and the 230 souls aboard was either floating on the surface or on the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean, several miles off the southern shore of Long Island. Many of the bodies had been horribly mutilated, in some cases even decapitated. When the flight disappeared from the radar scopes of New York Air Traffic Control, the controller handling the flight made numerous attempts to contact the aircraft. All failed. Then, another airliner who had been above the flight path of TWA 800 but traveling in the opposite direction reported seeing an aircraft explode in midair. It was quickly determined that aircraft had been TWA 800. But what had caused the horrendous explosion? Initially, the only possible cause was thought to be a terrorist bomb, similar to the one which had destroyed Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in December of 1988, killing 259 passengers and crew and 11 people on the ground. Soon, however, another theory came to the forefront. The following morning, the authorities began receiving reports from individuals who had witnessed the event. Many of them were very credible. They stated that they had seen something rise from the water and strike the aircraft. Some witnessed several very bright explosions on or near the plane. These were followed by a massive petroleum explosion, and pieces of the aircraft were then observed falling into the ocean. Among those witnesses were 2 New York National Guard helicopter pilots on an evening training flight. Major Fritz Meyer, the instructor pilot, had served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. He had flown rescue helicopters over North Vietnam and seen many ground-to-air missiles fired at aircraft. He had absolutely no doubt that he had just witnessed an aircraft shot down by a surface-aired missile or missiles. Some small shoulder-fired missiles, also known as man-pads, which are similar to the one shown on this slide, could just reach the known altitude of TWA 800, but slightly larger rail-fired missiles, such as those manufactured by Iran and China, would have no difficulty reaching that height or even higher. They can be easily launched from small boats, and their larger warheads could inflict catastrophic damage. In the mid-morning of the day of the crash, a man who had demonstrated the ability to safely operate it rented a 30-foot sport fishing boat from a marina close to where TWA 800 went down. He was later described as having dark hair and eyes, a swarthy complexion, and he spoke with an unusual accent, possibly of Middle Eastern origin. He stated that he was going out with 3 friends for a day of fishing off the south coast of Long Island. The boat was to be returned by sunset. When it was not there the following morning, it was reported to authorities, including the police and Coast Guard. The boat was later discovered tied up in another marina some distance away. The police reported that the boat was spotless, wiped down so thoroughly that not one fingerprint was obtainable. The identification used by the renter was discovered to be false, and the credit card used by him for the rental was stolen. When the NTSB arrived on the scene, the investigation took a strange turn. In any aviation accident, the National Transportation Safety Board is the government agency which has the primary responsibility for conducting an aircraft accident investigation. An NTSB GO team had been dispatched within hours after the aircraft hit the water. After its arrival, the team began the methodical process of trying to determine what had caused the crash. Eventually, this process leads to a final report which states, quote, the probable cause of the accident. In the case of TWA 800, this standard protocol was quickly violated by the arrival of FBI agent in charge James Kallstrom, who became the face of the investigation to the general public. In what was described as a heavy-handed way, Kallstrom informed the NTSB personnel that the investigation was being taken over by the FBI, who would now control all aspects of the matter, even though that agency had no expertise in the field of aircraft accident investigation. When Kallstrom arrived, everything changed. He had apparently been in close contact with the White House and Department of Justice. It is generally accepted that the decisions concerning the takeover of the investigation from the NTSB were implemented by Kallstrom, but formulated by others. That decision was far above his pay grade. Over the years, the tendency of the FBI to be somewhat overbearing and dismissive in its dealings with other law enforcement agencies has become legendary and is generally not well appreciated. That modus operandi was particularly evident in this case. Kallstrom set the tone, and most of the agents under him followed suit. A pall of uncertainty and suspicion began to emerge among the non-FBI personnel. Everyone sensed something was wrong about how this process was being handled, but no one knew why. When NTSB personnel protested this unprecedented action, they were told to back off or face criminal prosecution for obstructing a federal criminal investigation. For better or worse, the FBI was now in charge, and they were playing hardball. Let's look at this slide. To explain, the normal procedures are, initially, first responders arrive on the scene and attempt to secure the area and help any survivors. Next, the NTSB GO team arrives and begins to collect data. Witnesses are interviewed, and the wreckage is examined in detail. The remains of fatalities are collected and taken to a local morgue for identification and autopsies. If the scene is catastrophic, where little resembling an aircraft remains, NTSB investigators meticulously canvass the entire site, gathering everything that can be found to be taken to a reconstruction facility or to laboratories for evaluation and testing. Each item is carefully tagged and cataloged to begin to build a picture of the causal factors of the event. Finally, when a reconstruction site is established and enough pieces of wreckage are available to reconstruct the aircraft, system teams from various groups like the airline, unions, aircraft manufacturer, federal agencies, and others are tasked with going through possibly hundreds of thousands of parts to reassemble the airframe. Careful documentation is essential. At the time of the crash, a very large salvage barge owned by Weeks Marine, a highly experienced marine salvage company, was in the immediate area. Coast Guard rescue logs indicate that Weeks was asked to provide assistance within an hour of the crash. That request was subsequently withdrawn, and the Navy was tasked with recovery of the wreckage, although it could take days or even weeks for naval salvage vessels to arrive on scene. Why was this decision made? The obvious answer is to maintain security and secrecy, but why was that necessary? Because of the refusal of the FBI to allow Weeks Marine salvage barge to immediately commence salvage operations, it took the Navy 5 days to arrive at the scene with the USS Grasp, and nearly 2 weeks for the USS Grapple, which then became the primary salvage vessel used in the recovery of the wreckage. The families of the victims were frantic to have their loved ones brought to the surface before they could be further desecrated by sea creatures, which would surely happen, and unfortunately in many cases did. Their entreaties were ignored by Kallstrom and his team. They had a preconceived plan, and they were sticking to it. Now, the real violations of protocol and procedures began. The divers carefully video documented the location of each piece of wreckage and human remains as they were found on the seafloor. Parts were marked with grease pencils prior to being brought to the surface, loaded on barges, and taken to the dock for unloading. However, before they could be logged in and loaded on trucks for transport to the reconstruction hangar at Calverton, FBI agents began removing selected parts and placing them in vans. Something else occurred. FBI personnel were seen pressure washing selected pieces of wreckage. This could obliterate the previously mentioned markings and remove all traces of materials adhering to the metal. When some NTSB people protested the removal of evidence, they were told that these pieces were being taken to the FBI labs in Washington for testing and would be returned. Again, they were not being properly logged in and accounted for, or even kept in the condition which existed when recovered. Why? As can be imagined, the job of reconstructing something as large as a 747, using possibly hundreds of thousands of parts, was a daunting task. And it was a morbid atmosphere to work in as well. Many investigators remarked afterward that the whole hangar constantly smelled of death. As the project continued, it quickly became evident that many of the pieces of the puzzle were missing, and those were from the most important area, the place where the massive petroleum explosion was supposed to have taken place. Could these have been some of those removed by the FBI on the dock? As the systems people continued their work, more unusual issues arose. They were body searched each evening prior to leaving the hangar, and all notes taken during the day were confiscated by FBI agents. Cameras with film taken of the wreckage were also confiscated. The FBI agents stated that the photographs would be developed and returned to the NTSB personnel. It was suspected, however, that many were not. One investigator caught an FBI agent pounding on a piece of the skin of the aircraft with a small sledgehammer, thereby distorting the specimen. When confronted, the agent denied doing so. Well, Tampering with evidence was totally against protocol and completely illegal. Why had he done that? During the weeks of the Reconstruction, bizarre behavior on part of the FBI officials continued to emerge. The practice of body searches and confiscation of notes continued. It became a them versus us operation between the FBI and many of the accident investigators. Our ALPA systems team was staying at the local Holiday Inn. After a long day at the hangar, it became a standard practice to have the team members come back to the hotel, clean up, and have dinner. Then they would spend several more hours being debriefed as they tried to remember and reconstruct what they had seen, heard, and accomplished during the day. Extensive notes were taken of the data, but the underlying fact remained. The actions of the FBI were threatening and demoralizing to all the team members. They felt that they were being treated as suspects or criminals, not qualified accident investigators. It was becoming abundantly clear that this was no ordinary aviation accident investigation, but again, no one knew why. Things continued downhill. On July the 24th, 1996, Valerie Caproni, Deputy U.S. Attorney for New York, informed the NTSB that the FBI would not allow the NTSB to interview eyewitnesses, see any of the FBI Form 302 eyewitness reports, or share any other information with the parties to the investigation. Let's look at who they were. The so-called interested parties to the investigation included Boeing Aircraft Corporation, Trans World Airlines, the Airline Pilots Association, the International Association of Machinists, the International Federation of Flight Attendants, and other aircraft component manufacturers. After July 24, 1996, all these parties were prohibited from participating in any of the seaborne recovery efforts. NTSB Chairman Jim Hall, through his Vice Chairman Robert Francis, no relation by the way, agreed to this shocking and unprecedented development without protest. Most of the professional investigators on the case were appalled. In all their careers, they had never seen anything like this. Another thing surfaced. Since no one outside the FBI, the government was monitoring the actions of the FBI, CIA, or NTSB, it was entirely possible that a cover-up was in progress. But why? And to what purpose? If the Weeks Marine salvage barge had been utilized instead of waiting for the Navy, all the civilian divers would have had full legal rights and protections under the law, while on duty or off. Not so in the case of the naval personnel. They were covered under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, and that code can be overridden by the President as Commander-in-Chief of all military forces. A soldier or sailor can be ordered to remain silent pertaining to classified operations, and extremely severe penalties can be imposed for violations. Apparently, President Clinton felt that the UCMJ wording wasn't strong enough after he brought the Navy in to do the salvage effort. So, on March 9, 1997, Mr. Clinton signed Executive Order 13039. That order removed the naval personnel involved in the TWA 800 recovery mission from protection afforded by Chapter 71, Title 5 of the United States Code. This particular law is commonly referred to as the Whistleblower Protection Act. The reason cited for the executive order was national security. But why was this necessary? It is quite possible that when public allegations surfaced of a possible friendly fire shoot-down of TWA 800, that high officials in the executive, justice, and transportation departments entered into a conspiracy to subvert both the civil and criminal investigations into the loss of the airliner. Despite a total lack of evidence, the unified position would soon be to support a finding of an explosion in the center wing tank caused by an unknown mechanical failure. Unfortunately, the national media bought into the scenario and refused to examine the obvious questions which arose to dispute the government's claims. As is always the case in a cover-up, once stated, it is impossible to put the genie back in the bottle, and this was a very big genie. As work progressed and more of the aircraft was brought to the hangar and the reconstruction continued, seats and carpeting were assembled on the hangar floor in exactly the position they were placed in the aircraft, and one unusual issue emerged. There was a strange red residue on the back of several seats, located just behind the place where the nose section had detached from the rest of the aircraft. No one knew what it was or how it got there. Since the FBI showed no interest in determining its significance, one of the TWA group was able to surreptitiously obtain a small sample of the material, and because of the bizarre attitude of the FBI, he decided to have it independently analyzed. That individual was TWA Management Captain Terry Stacy. He provided that sample to James Sanders, a retired police detective turned investigative journalist. Laboratory testing indicated that the sample contained a high content of chemicals not consistent with the seat fabric or the 3M adhesive which attached it to the seat frame, but that were found in explosives and solid rocket fuels. The removal of this fabric and its unauthorized testing would soon have serious consequences for several individuals besides James Sanders, specifically for Elizabeth Sanders, a TWA flight attendant and the wife of James Sanders, and Captain Terry Stacy. Because of their attempt to shed some light on the mystery substance, Kallstrom saw to it that their credibility and reputations were dragged through the mud. He made sure that Stacy and the Sanders were eventually conspicuously arrested, with the press there to document the process. Sound familiar? Then he saw to it that they were prosecuted, and in the case of the Sanders, convicted of interfering with a criminal investigation being conducted by the FBI, specifically of stealing aircraft parts. Stacy ended up pleading guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge in order to save his flying career and pension. It must be noted that all this occurred after the FBI had declared there was no criminal activity involved, but instead the crash was caused by a mechanical malfunction. Then why the move to prosecute Captain Stacy and the Sanders? It was obvious that Captain Stacy and the Sanders were being made examples of what would happen to anyone who went against the government stance and tried to bring out the truth about the incident, pure and simple. I will show no pictures of the victims, out of respect for them and their families. Suffice to say, they are deeply disturbing. As the bodies of the victims were recovered, it became the job of Suffolk County Coroner Dr. Charles Whitley to conduct autopsies and provide death certificates. Two things became instantly clear. First, that nearly all the victims had died of severed spinal cords. Their necks were broken by a horrific side displacement of the aircraft, a movement so violent that for a fraction of a second, their body was subjected to nearly 60 Gs. That meant a normal person's head, weighing something like 11 pounds, would suddenly weigh 660 pounds, instantly snapping the neck. Could a low-velocity explosion of a few gallons of fuel in the center section tank of the aircraft have caused that? The answer is absolutely not. Only a severe, high-velocity explosion could have had that effect. The second curious issue which surfaced was that persons who had been sitting on the left forward side of the aircraft were found to have numerous pieces of metal embedded in their bodies. Dr. Wentley said that the x-rays of these people lit up like a Christmas tree with metal particles. Were these bits of shrapnel from a bomb or missile? We don't know, because the FBI agents attending the autopsies confiscated all these metal bits as they were removed from the victims. Why would they need to do that? Another indication of the violence and severity of the explosion was that pieces of human bone from these victims were found driven through the metal skin of the fuselage. In addition, their eyeballs were singed or scorched, as if subjected to intense heat or an extremely bright flash. A low-velocity petroleum explosion simply never could have done that. This is one of the black box flight recorders commonly found on commercial airliners. You will note that they aren't black, but instead painted a highly visible international orange. There are two on every large commercial aircraft, usually located in the vertical stabilizer in the tail. One, the voice recorder, records the conversations in the cockpit, ATC radio traffic, and conversations between the cockpit and cabin crew. The other, the flight data recorder, monitors and records a myriad of information about flight instruments and aircraft systems. They both contain pingers to produce a sound allowing them to be recovered if submerged. These devices are battery-powered and will last for approximately 3 weeks after being activated. The pingers were clearly heard by Coast Guard vessels on the night of the accident, prior to the arrival of Navy dive teams. After the USS Grasp arrived, they both suddenly quit and were silent for several days before they miraculously reactivated, were found by the Navy divers, and recovered for examination. On transcription, there was found to be an unexplained 4-second gap at the end of the voice recorder tape, just prior to power failure. What might that have contained, and how did it occur, since the unit was found to be in good working order and sitting upright on a flat sand bottom, not in the wreckage of the tail, which would have been suspected? That has never been satisfactorily explained. To distract the public from what was probably the cause of the crash, the government had to come up with a theory which was both complicated enough to fool a layman and difficult to dispute one way or another. A mysterious explosion of fuel vapors in the center wing tank was the perfect choice, or so they thought. To prove this theory, tests were performed on a 747 center wing tank at a research facility at Bruntingthorpe, England. Why there, by the way? Were there similar facilities available in our country? Unfortunately for them, Jet A fuel is quite non-volatile except under specific circumstances, and they couldn't make it explode. According to unbiased witnesses who have since come forth, first, they filled it with the amount of Jet A fuel supposedly contained in the center wing tank of TWA 800. Then, they put propane burners under the tank to warm the fuel to the estimated temperature of the fuel aboard, supposedly an incredible 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, they used a simple spark plug for the ignition factor. Nothing happened. Next, they upped the temperature until the fuel was boiling. Again, nothing. Not to be deterred, they inserted a jet engine igniter, or kind of a spark plug on steroids, at a position only 12 inches above the boiling fuel. That produced a much larger spike. That wouldn't ignite the fuel tank either. Finally, they filled the remainder of the tank with a highly volatile gas, propane, and indeed, it finally exploded with catastrophic results, as can be imagined. The problem was, those results didn't match the remains of the center wing tank on TWA 800. In the months prior to the crash of TWA 800, the Navy had been conducting experimental tests of the ability to intercept and shoot down a missile fired at an aircraft. At least one of these tests was performed using a combined task force of surface vessels and submarines off the coast of Virginia and witnessed by many non-military personnel. Filming that operation was a Navy P-3 Orion subchaser aircraft. On the night of the crash, a P-3 was almost directly overhead when TWA 800 exploded. It took extensive videos of the flaming wreckage on the sea and remained in the area for a full half hour before proceeding on what was later described as a normal submarine detection exercise, some 200 miles to the south. Although there is no record of a drone being used in the training exercise that was being performed offshore in the W-105 warning area that night, pieces of a naval target drone were reportedly found by dredging crews of scallop trawlers during the dredging operation to bring the smaller pieces of the wreckage to the surface. Since the FBI agents hadn't mentioned to the trawler crews the possibility of finding this type of material, these pieces were apparently thrown back in the water. However, they were later described in detail by scallop trawler crew members and identified by the manufacturer of the drones as probably being drone fuselage parts. What might have been the significance of this evidence? As more and more pieces were brought up from the ocean floor, a pattern began to emerge. The search was divided into 3 zones: red, yellow, and green. The first being the calculated spot where the aircraft exploded. The second, where more debris was located, including the nose section. And the third, where the very last bits of wreckage were found, including the majority of the fuselage, right wing, and 3 of the engines. Each piece of wreckage was cataloged and received a color-coded tag indicating where the piece was recovered. Unfortunately for the FBI, CIA, and head of the NTSB, things weren't showing up in the positions which would be expected if the scenario being pushed had occurred. Well, how to solve that problem? Simple. If the facts don't fit the required narrative, just change the facts. Tags were being changed by individuals unknown, and after the hangar had supposedly been locked up and secured for the night. As we will see, this wasn't the last time this type of behavior occurred. Thus, items as large as the number 3 engine were moved from one zone to another. The honest investigators were outraged when they discovered this subterfuge. When they brought this to the attention of the FBI personnel, they were either ignored or threatened with removal from the accident investigation team. Several very credible witnesses described a brilliant white plume which appeared behind the aircraft after the first blight flash, following the sighting of a light and vapor trail which appeared to strike the left side of the aircraft. A proximity explosion close to the left wing would have caused enormous hydraulic pressures in the nearly full wing tanks. That pressure literally shattered the upper surface of the wing, releasing the fuel into the slipstream. A large number of small jagged pieces of the left wing were in fact found in the red zone, not the green zone where the rest ended up. The pressures of that explosion apparently caused the unzipping of the fuselage, the detachment of the nose section, and the explosion in the center wing tank, which is described in the IAM analysis on this slide. Let's read it together. A definite cause cannot be determined at this time. The center wing fuel tank did explode. We find that its explosion was as the result of the aircraft breakup. The initial event caused a structural failure in the area of Flight Station 854 to 860, lower left side of the aircraft. A high-pressure event breached the fuselage, and the fuselage unzipped due to the event. The explosion was a result of this event. It appears to the IAM that a major event may have occurred on the left side of the aircraft. It could have contributed to or been the cause of the destruction of Flight 800. This phenomena is vividly depicted in the Epix documentary TWA Flight 800, which is available as a download from Amazon. You can also view another documentary, TWA 800 Silenced, on YouTube. Be sure to view the full version. It's a bit grainy, but very worthwhile. Now enter into the scenario Commander William Donaldson III, a retired Navy pilot. Commander Donaldson heard on the radio that the government was now stating that a mechanical malfunction had caused an explosion in the center tank of the aircraft, initiating the crash sequence. His long experience as a naval aviator and accident investigator immediately set off alarm bells in his head. How was it possible for a low-velocity, petroleum-based explosion to literally blow off the forward third of a 775,000-pound aircraft? For Donaldson, that concept defied reason and logic. Later, he read an article written by Jim Hall, the Clinton-appointed head of the NTSB, which stated emphatically that the aircraft had been brought down by a mechanical failure, not a bomb or missile. How could Hall come to this conclusion so quickly, especially in light of the many credible reports of missile sightings? Hall intimated the supposed rocket sightings had falsely been mistaken for burning fuel, which was streaming from the aircraft after the nose was blown off and the airplane supposedly commenced the aerodynamically impossible zoom climb to nearly 18,000 feet. This theory, called a cartoon by those who understand the principles of aerodynamics, was nonetheless emphasized in the video the CIA produced at the request of Kallstrom and the FBI. Deeply disturbed by what he perceived as an apparent attempt to cover up the true cause of the horrific crash, Donaldson wrote a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal, refuting the rush to judgment by Hall. Thus began a 4-year effort on his part to discover the truth about the crash. He founded the Associated Retired Aviation Professionals, or A.R.A.P, which included retired airline pilots, such as United Airlines Captain Ray Lahr, witness to the accident Major Fritz Meyer of the New York National Guard, a retired Navy Rear Admiral, and many others. A.R.A.P proceeded to look into the faulty investigation, filing many FOIA claims to release confidential government documents, including the names of the hundreds of witnesses which were now considered classified. These men were responsible, knowledgeable people, not aluminum foil cap-wearing conspiracy theorists. Bill Donaldson then wrote letters to the managements of TWA and Boeing, urging them not to go along with the obvious cover-up in progress. In July of 1998, he authored a 127-page report at the request of members of the House of Representatives Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation. Tragically, Commander Donaldson was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor in January of 2001. He died in August of that year, only a few days before 9/11. He was only 56 years old at the time of his death. The quest for the truth had lost a precious advocate. One of the basic laws of the sea is that any vessel, civilian or military, is required to give aid to another ship or entity if an emergency occurs. Well, seeing flaming wreckage falling from the sky would certainly fall under that category, don't you think? However, the radar at the Iceless Airport observed a radar trace of a vessel offshore proceeding directly away from the scene at high speed, immediately following the explosion overhead. For the ship to be picked up by that ground-based radar would have to have been in excess of 50 feet high off the water. The only vessel matching that description was a large gray ship with large white numerals on its bow, which had been observed by beachgoers earlier that evening, proceeding eastbound and later returning westbound shortly before the explosion overhead. Navy records indicate that the USS Carr, a guided missile frigate, was engaged with other surface and subsurface vessels, including the fast attack submarine USS Seawolf, in a training exercise off the coast of Long Island on the night in question. Both the Carr and the Seawolf reportedly had the capacity to launch anti-missile missiles, the Seawolf even while submerged. Interestingly, the crews of all ships engaged in that training exercise were also listed in the previously mentioned Executive Order 13039 signed by President Clinton, even though they hadn't participated in the recovery operation. Why was that necessary? After leaving the training exercise, the Carr proceeded to Bermuda, where her crew was basically kept incommunicado, with no emails or phone calls allowed, for several days thereafter. It is believed that the Seawolf, since it was technically undergoing sea trials as it had not been formally commissioned, returned to the factory at Groton, Connecticut, where the ship and crew were kept under a veil of secrecy. After many months of FOIA requests, A.R.A.P acquired the actual tapes of the radar data from New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, or TRACON, and the Islip Airport Approach Control Radar. The radar data from these facilities is shown here. Let's examine it. Analysis of the data clearly showed a trail of material exiting the right side of the aircraft at a speed of nearly Mach 4. That's shown in the tan shaded area just to the right of the red TWA 800 aircraft symbol. This was before the last transponder transmission and just prior to the nose section departing the aircraft. This ejected material could only be the result of a high-velocity explosion. The center wing tank event was a low-velocity petroleum explosion and could not have done this. Note the suspicious boat track coming from the upper right-hand side of the plot and passing almost directly underneath the flight path of TWA 800. Could this have been the chartered fishing boat? The radar data also showed the mystery ship departing the area at over 30 knots. Was this the USS Carr? Shortly after taking office in 1993, President Clinton appointed James Hall, a close personal friend of Vice President Al Gore, to the NTSB. After only a year as a board member, Hall was promoted to the position of chairman. Hall had no qualifications for that job at all. The Washington Post jokingly commented that Hall's single qualification for the transportation position appeared to be that he had a driver's license. He was, however, a loyal political partisan and perfectly willing to follow orders from the White House. Hall's vice chairman was Robert Francis, who formerly headed the FAA's Paris office. He too was extremely loyal to President Clinton, who had appointed him to the board. Any objectivity at the helm of the NTSB was lacking if it ran counter to the desires of the president. This would have significant consequences after July 17, 1996. Hall put Francis in charge of the TWA investigation, and he was all too willing to allow the FBI under Kallstrom to take over, although they had no legal right to do so. Unless, that is, the DOJ attorneys declared the crash to be a crime scene, which they never did. Hank Hughes arrived early on July 18th with the NTSB GO team. He was not a political appointee, but rather a consummate professional, having been involved in aircraft accident investigations for over 26 years. He was, like most of the NTSB investigators, horrified to see what was occurring after Chairman Hall and Vice Chairman Francis allowed the FBI to take over the investigation in a completely unorthodox and probably illegal manner. For the December 1997 Baltimore hearing on the TW-800 crash, he had written a report numbering nearly 500 pages. Strangely, he was ordered not to include a conclusion as part of that document, a procedure which was standard policy for all investigations of this type. In addition, as the day of the hearing drew near, he found that his report had been edited to less than 50 pages, again, with no summary conclusion included. After retiring from the NTSB, he was so disturbed by what had happened that he offered to help the members of A.R.A.P reopen the TWA-800 investigation. He has since stated that if he had been allowed to include a conclusion as part of the report, it would have been that the aircraft was, and I quote, brought down by an explosion or explosions external to the aircraft. In other words, Hughes believed the evidence clearly showed that TWA-800 had been shot down by a missile or missiles and not destroyed by an explosion of unknown origin in the center wing tank. Unlike Hughes, David Mayer was a relatively new employee of the NTSB when he participated in the TWA-800 investigation. As such, he was eager to please the higher-ups in the organization, particularly Chairman Hall and Vice Chairman Francis. He was frequently observed changing the evidence tags on many of the aircraft pieces involved, thereby moving their location to a different zone which would better suit the narrative which the FBI, CIA, and NTSB leadership were pushing. When investigator Hank Hughes asked him why he was doing this, Meyer stated that it was to make the investigation more understandable to his superiors. At the Baltimore hearing, it became obvious that Mayer thought it was his job to discredit allegations by any eyewitness who had seen what they frequently described as a rocket, flare, or missile rise from the surface and strike the aircraft. When asked how so many similar accounts could be wrong, he stated that he couldn't answer that question. Perhaps it was some sort of mass hysteria, he said. At that point, someone in the audience raised a sign and shouted, "Why don't you ask the witnesses?" Chairman Hall immediately came to Mayer's defense and threatened to remove anyone who made another outburst. No one did, and an obedient press corps swallowed the government narrative whole, repeating it virtually verbatim on the nightly news and in print media. The fix was in. Don't try to confuse them with the facts. On Tuesday, August the 15th, 2000, a group of individuals who were witnesses to the crash of TWA 800 purchased a full-page ad in the Washington Times. That ad expressed their outrage that not a single eyewitness had been allowed to testify at the week-long NTSB hearing in Baltimore, nor had any of their written interview testimony been included in the record. They hoped this would affect the NTSB meeting on August 22, 23, which would review and presumably approve the final probable cause report on the accident. It was a last-ditch attempt to bring vital evidence to the attention of the general public. When the FOIA obtained copies of the FBI Form 302 interviews were finally shown to various witnesses by the A.R.A.P, many of them were astounded. They stated that much of the information contained was totally fabricated and that some of the interviews listed had not even taken place. In fact, none of the interviews were even tape recorded. In one such listed second interview, witness 73, who had possibly the best view of the aircraft before, during, and after it exploded, supposedly changed her story and admitted to having several alcoholic Long Island iced teas before her reported sighting. That interview had never occurred, and in fact, she is a confirmed teetotaler. She does not drink any alcoholic beverages at all. Unfortunately, the witnesses were once again ignored, and the report was published as written. What followed was the contentious 2000 election and all that would occur on 9/11, an event which might have been avoided if the true cause of the crash of TWA 800 had been released. After his retirement from the NTSB, Hank Hughes joined A.R.A.P in requesting a reopening of the case. He was uniquely qualified to do so, since he had been part and parcel to virtually every aspect of the investigation from the morning of July 18, 1996 on. Hughes was deeply troubled. He felt the investigation had been botched, and he wanted to find out why. Unfortunately, politics again became part of the equation. In 2015, another individual involved with the 1996 administration had become the presumptive presidential nominee of a political party. So, once again bringing up the events which transpired after TWA 800 went down would just let another very embarrassing genie out of the bottle. That must not be allowed to happen. So, under two different NTSB chairmen that year, both appointed by President Obama, the reconsideration was briefly debated and finally completely denied. Obviously, human nature tends to prevent individuals from admitting to an error, but when that error involves willful violations of normal protocols and even ignoring possible illegal activities in the process, it is all the more troubling. Our system of government, especially our legal system, requires that the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth be demanded of a witness. When those truths are simply ignored for reason or reasons unknown, a complete breakdown of the system is possible. I believe that is exactly what happened in the case of the crash of TWA 800, and it cannot be allowed to stand. This book, by Jack Cashel, is in my opinion the best researched and best yet written concerning the crash of TWA 800. I could literally speak for hours on the subject. I've only scratched the surface. It is my opinion that this is the most egregious cover-up our government has perpetrated in my lifetime. There are two things that Americans must be able to depend on: our law enforcement personnel and our military. In the case of TWA 800, both these institutions were allowed to be perverted for what can only be considered narrow political reasons. Americans died, and their deaths didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. That led to more deaths on 9/11 and could lead to more in the future. A shoot-down or shoot-down of domestic airliners in this country would bring our air transportation system to a screaming halt, and that possibility is unfortunately all too real. So I leave it to you. What are the implications for the future? Well, that's it. As I said in the beginning of this presentation, I have laid out the basic facts as I know them. I have a personal opinion as to what happened to TWA 800. There are actually several possible credible scenarios. However, I am absolutely positive of one thing. The aircraft was not brought down by an explosion caused by a spark igniting Jet A fuel vapors in the center section fuel tank. That simply did not happen. Someone in the Clinton administration, perhaps Deputy National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, who was on duty at the White House the night of July 17th, felt that if the true reason for the crash came out, it would seriously undermine Clinton's chances for re-election. So, another theory must be devised. Various politically motivated members of several federal agencies then bought off on the concept, and the cover-up began and has continued to this day. We all know the saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So what do you think happened to TWA 800? If you would like to comment on this presentation or ask a question, please go to my website as listed below. I personally answer all comments I receive, and I thank you for watching.